The tournament hall hummed with a low electric energy. It was a symphony of hushed whispers, the rhythmic clicks of camera shutters, and the soft, expectant scrapes of chairs being adjusted. The air, thick with the scent of coffee and nervous sweat, hung heavy under the glow of 1,000 lights. At the center of this maelstrom of ambition and talent sat the titans of the game. Grandmasters in tailored suits, their movements as precise and calculated as the opening moves of a game. They were sponsored, lauded, and draped in the logos of tech giants and luxury brands. And then there was her. She sat at the far end of the hall, a lone star in a constellation of polished professionals. Her chair seemed to slump under her, as if it too had given up on the pretense of importance. She wore a jacket that had seen better days, its elbows worn thin, and its color faded to an indeterminate shade of gray. Her shoes, scuffed and a size too large, shuffled quietly under the table. No sponsors, no entourage, just her and the profound silence she seemed to carry with her. Her name was Anya Petrov, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the room. Across from her sat the reigning champion, a man named Viktor Volkov. He was all sharp lines and arrogance, his movements a theatrical display of confidence. A slight smirk played on his lips as he surveyed his opponent. He had heard the whispers, the dismissive chatter, the wild card, they called her. A charity case who had somehow stumbled into the tournament. He saw no threat, only an easy victory. The cameras, bored with the non-event of the match, had mostly turned their lenses toward the more glamorous boards. The referee, a portly man with a disapproving frown, gave a curt nod. The clock started its quiet, insistent count. Anya's hand, calloused and rough, moved toward her queen's knight. She didn't hesitate. With a surprising swiftness, she advanced it forward. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Victor's smirk widened. The move was highly unorthodox, a classic rookie mistake. It exposed her king, leaving him vulnerable from the very start. The commentators, their voices live-streamed to millions, scoffed. "Is she even a player?" One scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's a move a beginner makes. What is she thinking?" The other commentator, a former grandmaster, let out a chuckle. "Perhaps she's playing a new variant of the game, one where you surrender on the first move." Laughter, a jarring, uncharitable sound, echoed through the hall. It was a collective guffaw of dismissal, a pronouncement that she did not belong. Victor leaned back, his confidence radiating. He moved his pawn, a simple, textbook response, and the game continued. But Anya's hands, resting on the edge of the table, trembled. It wasn't the tremor of nerves, not the shiver of fear. It was a deep, visceral shaking, a response to a long-ago trauma. She kept her eyes fixed on the board, a deep well of calm in a sea of ridicule. She moved her next piece, another unusual, seemingly reckless move. The cameras, sensing a spectacle, finally turned toward her. With each turn, her hand moved with a fragile certainty. Her body held taut with a quiet intensity. The trembling was more pronounced now, a subtle vibration that traveled up her arm. Victor, growing bored, made another move, certain he had her cornered. He was already planning his victory speech, the headlines in his mind. Then, a sudden sharp twist of her body, and the worn sleeve of her jacket shifted. For a brief, terrifying moment, a patch of her skin was visible. Not the soft, unmarked skin of a person who had lived a sheltered life, but a canvas of crisscrossing lines. Deep, raised scars, a roadmap of a past she had tried to bury. The marks of a fire. They were not just on her arm, but seemed to be a part of her, a living memory. The laughter faltered. A stunned silence descended upon the hall. The commentators, suddenly quiet, stared at the screen showing a close-up of her arm. Victor's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a look of confusion and unease. The crowd, a moment ago a unified voice of mockery, now felt the weight of their judgment. They saw not a rookie, but a survivor, a person who had fought battles far more brutal than any on a chessboard. The ridicule had been replaced by a chilling silence, a quiet respect that she had never sought but now earned in a single, heart-stopping moment. The game, once a source of amusement, had become something else entirely. It was a story, and Anya, the ridiculed player, was finally ready to tell it. The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of ambition and old wood. It was the scent of the World Chess Championship, an annual conclave where the greatest minds on the planet gathered to do battle over 64 squares. The hall itself was a monument to the game. Polished mahogany tables gleamed under spotlights, and the hushed whispers of grandmasters and commentators created a solemn, reverent atmosphere. For the players who had trained their entire lives for this moment, it was a sacred space. And then there was Anya Petrov. She was an anomaly, an error in the perfect, pristine system of the elite. Every other competitor was a name you knew, a face you'd seen on billboards and in sports magazines. They had sponsors, entourages, and pedigrees from the world's most exclusive chess academies. Anya had none of it. She had entered through a last-minute wildcard registration, a slot that was usually reserved for a promising youth prodigy or a returning legend. No one knew her. She appeared on the official tournament roster as a mere footnote, a name typed in a font a little smaller than the rest. The media, a pack of hungry wolves circling the boards, barely gave her a second glance. A reporter from a major sports network, scribbling furiously in his notebook, dismissed her with a flick of his wrist. "Just a charity seat," he muttered to his cameraman, not bothering to lower his voice. "Some feel-good story the organizers cooked up to pretend the game is accessible. Other players, she'll be out in the first round." A parade of impeccably dressed men and women gave her a wide berth. They moved through the hall like royalty, their confidence a tangible aura. They saw her quiet presence as a weakness, her faded jacket and worn shoes as proof of her unworthiness. When she passed by, they would exchange mocking glances, a whispered joke about her outdated style of play. They called her the Ghost because she was there but no one truly saw her. Her moves were not flashy or aggressive. They were deliberate, slow, and methodical, a style more suited to the quiet, dusty halls of a forgotten era than the lightning-fast, high-stakes arena of modern chess. Anya didn't seem to notice their disdain. She sat at her designated table, her hands folded in her lap, a serene and distant look in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the board, or at the crowd, or at the flashing cameras. She was looking inward, as if reviewing 1,000 past games in her mind. Her silence wasn't shyness. It was a fortress, a protective wall she had built around herself. She was an outsider, not just to the tournament, but to the world itself. But one person saw her. The tournament director, a man named Marcus Thorne, was a legend in his own right. He was a former grandmaster who had traded the board for a clipboard, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. He had seen countless players rise and fall, witnessed the birth of prodigies and the quiet decline of champions. From his perch on a raised platform, he watched the proceedings, his gaze sweeping over the hall like a searchlight. His eyes lingered on Anya. He had been the one to approve her last-minute entry, a decision that had baffled his staff. "She has an extraordinary rating," he had told them, his voice firm, "and she has earned the right to be here." But the rating was from a small, obscure online federation, not the official one, and no one believed it. They thought he was being sentimental, a soft touch. As he watched her now, he didn't see a charity case or a rookie. He saw a depth in her eyes that transcended the game. They weren't the eyes of a competitor hungry for victory, or the eyes of a prodigy consumed by talent. They were the eyes of a survivor. He had seen that look before, in a different life, in a different kind of arena. The cold, calculating stare of someone who had faced down an insurmountable opponent, and against all odds, lived to tell the tale. It was a look of quiet resilience, of a spirit forged in the crucible of unimaginable hardship. It was a look that said, "I have nothing left to lose, because I have already lost it all." Anya shifted in her chair, a slight movement that broke her trance. Her eyes, meeting his for a brief moment across the bustling hall, held a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he, and only he, truly understood her presence here. This wasn't about chess for her. It was about something else entirely. And Marcus, watching her, knew that the real game had just begun. The first few rounds of the tournament were a blur of predictable openings and textbook strategies. Grandmasters clashed in brilliant, symmetrical battles, each move a calculated response to the last. For the onlookers, it was a familiar, satisfying ballet of intellect. But at Anya's board, the dance was different. It was clumsy, awkward, and, to the expert eye, utterly illogical. In her first match against a rising prodigy, she opened with a move that chess theory had long since dismissed as a relic of a bygone era. The commentators, baffled, could barely contain their laughter. "It's like watching someone try to drive a Model T in a Formula One race," one of them quipped, the joke resonating with the derisive murmurs from the audience. The prodigy, a teenager with a mop of bleached hair and an ego to match, spent an extra minute on his move, his lip curled in a smirk of profound condescension. He saw not an opponent, but an easy point. He went on to make a series of aggressive, powerful moves, confident he had her cornered. But with each move he made, her hands, trembling ever so slightly, would move to a piece that seemed insignificant, a pawn or a rook that had no business being in that square. She was building not a fortress, but a series of interconnected invisible tripwires. And then, with a simple capture of a seemingly useless pawn, the prodigy's entire strategy collapsed. His powerful pieces were suddenly rendered impotent, his grand attack a tangled mess of his own making. The final move, a checkmate that appeared out of nowhere, was so subtle and unexpected that it took the prodigy a full 30 seconds to comprehend what had happened. He sat there, pale and disbelieving, a victim of a trap so simple and yet so brilliant that it defied explanation. The audience, however, refused to be impressed. They had expected an easy win for their favorite, and her victory felt less like a triumph and more like a fluke. The whispers in the hall turned from mockery to suspicion. "Beginner's luck," someone sneered, and the sentiment rippled through the crowd. She got lucky. The kid choked. Her victory was not attributed to skill, but to the randomness of chance. As the tournament progressed, a pattern emerged. Anya's opponents, one after another, fell victim to her unorthodox style. A renowned tactician, known for his relentless attacks, found himself suffocated by her passive defense. A defensive stalwart, famous for his impenetrable positions, was dismantled by a series of moves that seemed to have no purpose until it was too late. Each game followed the same perplexing arc. A predictable beginning, a series of seemingly weak moves from Anya, a chorus of ridicule, and then a sudden, inexplicable checkmate. Her opponents, unable to explain their losses, could only offer confused excuses to the press. "Her moves, they don't make sense," one said, his voice laced with frustration. "It's like she's playing a different game." Another, a seasoned grandmaster, simply shook his head. "I have never seen anything like it. It's not about skill, it's something else." The ridicule from the crowd grew louder, more personal. The polite sneers of the first day had devolved into outright hostility. They weren't just questioning her skill anymore. They were questioning her very right to be there. "She's a fraud!" a man yelled from the stands. "She's cheating." The accusation, baseless as it was, spread like wildfire. But Anya, a pillar of calm amidst the storm, never reacted. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on the board, her hands tightening around each piece as she made her move. Those hands were the only tell. The trembling was gone, replaced by a fierce, almost desperate grip on the carved wood. When she moved a rook or a pawn, her knuckles would whiten, and the deep, angry scars that crisscrossed the back of her hands would stand out, a silent testament to a hidden past. The chess pieces, for her, weren't just game components. They were something she held on to, a connection to a world she was struggling to inhabit. The ridicule, the accusations, the hostile whispers, they were all just noise, a distraction from the real battle happening within her. And Marcus Thorne, the tournament director, watched from his post. He saw what no one else did. A quiet brilliance forged not in the halls of academia, but in the crucible of unimaginable hardship. He saw a player whose moves were not a product of theory, but of instinct born from survival. She was not playing chess as a game. She was playing it as a metaphor for her life. And with each victory, each step closer to the championship, she was not just winning games. She was proving to a world that had tried to break her that she was, in fact, unbreakable. The final rounds of the tournament were a crucible, a high-stakes pressure cooker where every move was scrutinized, every breath held. Anya had somehow inexplicably made it to the semifinals. Her opponent was the world's #1 ranked player, a cold, calculating grandmaster with a reputation for merciless precision. The room was packed, the air thick with tension and the low hum of anticipation. Every camera in the hall was pointed at her board, waiting for the moment her improbable run would finally end. For the first time since the tournament began, Anya showed signs of a crack in her armor. The calm facade she had maintained for days began to falter under the immense pressure. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, and she subtly wiped it away. Her breath, usually so steady, hitched with a nervous tremor. Her opponent, a man who fed on weakness, saw it. A faint smile touched his lips as he moved a bishop forward, a classic attack designed to exploit her king's position. She stared at the board, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. The solution was there, somewhere in the labyrinth of her mind. But the pressure was a suffocating weight. The silence in the hall was deafening, the quiet anticipation of her inevitable collapse. She needed to move, but her hands were frozen. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, she reached for a pawn. As her arm moved, the worn cuff of her jacket sleeve caught on the table's edge and slid up, revealing the entirety of her forearm. The cameras, with their unforgiving zoom lenses, captured the image in stark, unflinching detail. The gasps from the audience were not for the chess move she was about to make, but for what was on her skin. Her hands, which had so confidently dismantled the world's best, were not smooth. They were a roadmap of pain. Deep, jagged cuts crisscrossed the back of her hands, some faded, some still angry and red. There were burns, too, raised welts of scar tissue that twisted her skin into grotesque patterns, a stark contrast to the smooth, polished wood of the chessboard. They weren't the scars of a clumsy childhood or a minor accident. They were the marks of violence, of a past she had desperately tried to keep hidden. The room fell into a stunned silence. The laughter, the sneers, the mocking whispers, all of it died instantly. The commentators on the live feed, who had been speculating on her eventual defeat, suddenly fell silent, their voices caught in their throats. Viktor Volkov, the champion she had beaten in an earlier round, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. The tournament director, Marcus Thorne, watched from his platform, his gaze fixed on her with a pained, knowing expression. The sight of her scars transformed her in the eyes of the crowd. She was no longer a charity case or a fraud. She was a survivor. The ridicule that had been a constant companion to her through the tournament now felt grotesque, a profound injustice. They had laughed at a person who had fought battles they couldn't even imagine. The chessboard, with its carefully defined rules and predictable outcomes, suddenly felt insignificant compared to the chaos and pain etched onto her skin. Whispers began to ripple through the stunned hall, but they were different now. They weren't whispers of mockery, but of speculation, of awe, and of shame. "Who is she really?" someone murmured, the question hanging in the air. What did she go through? For the first time, her story, the one she had carried silently for so long, began to seep into the collective consciousness of the room. The game, for a fleeting moment, no longer mattered. All that mattered was the weight of her past, now laid bare for the world to see. Anya, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, finally moved her pawn. It was a brilliant, counterintuitive move, a calculated risk that no one, not even the world's best player, had seen coming. Her hands, though scarred and trembling, had found their purpose once more. She was a master of the board, but they were a testament to the battles she had won long before she ever sat down at a chess table. The silence of the crowd was no longer one of dismissal, but of profound, humbling respect. The sudden, stunned silence in the tournament hall was a chasm of unspoken questions. Who was Anya Petrov? The truth, once buried, began to surface not through her words, but through the whispered rumors and the pained, knowing glances of a few who understood the language of silence. The story of her life was not one of chess prodigies or grand academies. It was a story of war, of survival, and of an inner battlefield that never truly went quiet. The first whispers came from a journalist who, in a desperate search for a scoop, had dug into the obscure online chess federation that had listed her. He found a single archived article from a regional news outlet, a forgotten story from a forgotten conflict. It wasn't about chess at all. It was about a besieged city, a hospital under fire, and a doctor named Anya Petrov who had stayed behind. Flashbacks, fleeting and fragmented, now played out in Anya's mind as she sat at the board. The polished wood of the chessboard blurred, replaced by the cold, unforgiving stone floor of a makeshift prison cell. The gentle click of a chess clock was drowned out by the echo of distant artillery fire. She wasn't a soldier, not in the formal sense, but she had been caught in the crossfire. As a doctor in a war-torn country, her battlefield was a field hospital where the wounds were deep and the resources were few. But it was in a prisoner of war camp that she truly learned to play. Her captors, bored and cruel, used their prisoners for their own amusement. They forced them into mock duels, a twisted game of cat and mouse where survival was the only prize. Anya, her medical skills useless in that context, was a prime target. One day, a high-ranking officer, an arrogant chess enthusiast, offered her a cruel choice: play him, and if she won, she would be granted a small mercy, a single ration of food, or a moment of quiet. If she lost, the consequences were unthinkable. In that bleak, unforgiving cell, with a crudely drawn board on a piece of slate and pieces carved from smuggled bread, Anya played for her life. The moves she made were not about grand strategy or elegant attacks. They were about survival. She had to outthink her enemy, not on a board but in a mind game of unimaginable stakes. Each move was a risk, a gamble with her own life and the lives of the other prisoners. The scars on her hands were not from combat. They were from the cuts and burns she endured as punishment for her victories. The jagged marks were a constant physical reminder of the nights she spent playing for her freedom. Chess was not a game to her. It was a way of life. The pawns were her allies, the queen her last resort, and the king, her most vulnerable piece, was a reflection of her own fragile humanity. When she was finally released, a broken and traumatized survivor, she carried the weight of that war with her. The chess moves she had learned in that prison cell were ingrained in her mind. A second language, a survival instinct that had been honed by fire. Now, sitting in the grand tournament hall, she wasn't just playing for a title. She was fighting a ghost, a memory of a past she could never escape. Every game she played carried the weight of that battlefield. The ridicule of the crowd, the smug confidence of her opponents, it all felt small, insignificant compared to the roar of artillery and the silent terror of those prison nights. Marcus Thorne, the tournament director, understood. He had seen the scars on her hands and read the history in her eyes. He knew that her unorthodox style was not a flaw, but a feature, a testament to her unique, brutal education. She was a master of a different kind of chess, one where the goal wasn't checkmate, but survival. And as she prepared to make her final move against the world champion, the room held its breath, no longer in mockery, but in awe of a player who had not just mastered a game, but had survived a war. The final move hung in the air, a silent thunderclap. Anya had advanced her last knight, a piece that had seemed insignificant just moments before, into a position of inescapable dominance. The checkmate was undeniable, a brilliant and brutal end to the game. For a few seconds, the world's #1 grandmaster stared at the board, his mind replaying the final sequence, searching for a flaw that wasn't there. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and tipped his king on its side. The universal sign of surrender. The silence that followed was not the hush of anticipation or the pregnant pause before a standing ovation. It was something far deeper, far more profound. It was the silence of a crowd humbled, their mockery and ridicule replaced by a dawning, collective shame. There were no cheers, no wild applause, only the soft click of a single camera and the quiet exhalation of 100 breaths. The champion, a man who had never known true defeat, lowered his head in silent acknowledgement. He had been beaten, not by a better chess player, but by a different kind of warrior. He looked across the table at Anya, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a newfound respect. She did not meet his gaze. Her hands, the scarred maps of her past, were already reaching for the pieces, gently putting them back in their box, as if tending to a fragile, treasured memory. The reporters, a pack of vultures who had feasted on her vulnerability, now descended with a different kind of hunger. They didn't rush forward with cameras and cutting remarks, but with a quiet reverence. They no longer saw a charity seat, but a story, a survivor who had fought a war on a chessboard and won. Their questions were not about her unconventional moves or her beginner's luck. They were about her, about the scars, and about the unspoken history that had led her to this moment. But Anya didn't answer. She didn't raise a fist in victory or boast about her improbable win. The victory was not a moment for grand gestures. It was a quiet, internal confirmation. She simply collected her worn jacket, zipping it up to conceal the scars that had been so briefly, so vulnerably exposed. Her movements were as economical and deliberate as her play. She did not linger to accept the trophy, the accolades, or the humbled apologies. She had earned something far more valuable than a title. She had earned respect, not for her skill, but for her survival. She walked out of the hall as quietly as she had entered. The crowd parted for her, a silent, reverent aisle of people who had, just a short time ago, laughed at her. They watched her go, a small, solitary figure who had upended their entire world, proving that the greatest victories are not won in the spotlight but in the quiet, unseen battles of the past. The final words of the tournament director, Marcus Thorne, echoed through the quiet hall, a powerful coda to the silence. He didn't speak of the game or the champion's defeat. He spoke of the player who had just left. On the chessboard, he said, his voice soft but clear. As in life, the strongest warriors are often the ones who have already survived the war.